Okay, so in this episode, we're looking at some criticisms of Rawls's view. The first criticism that I want to look at is that his theory is too indeterminate. It doesn't tell us exactly what kind of society that we ought to have. And Rawls indeed points this out rather, a long way into the book. Into this book I'm talking about, A Theory of Justice. He says that as far as his theory goes, it doesn't tell us whether we should prefer capitalism or socialism, for example. And he was writing this at a time where socialism was a viable political option. It was on the table. There were people out there who genuinely claimed to be socialist. It's not really true anymore. I don't think most people who call themselves, well, there are some people, but socialism doesn't seem to be a viable political proposal or agenda anymore. There are lots of people who call themselves socialists and for them that just means that they believe in helping out the poor a bit. But the idea that socialism, in the sense of large government control of private enterprise, or large government ownership of the means of production and exchange, that it meant when Rawls was writing this, I think that's more or less dead. Whether it should be or not, of course, one can debate, but it basically is. It is dead, although who knows what's going to happen at the end of the current COVID-19 crisis. It may well be that all of this is going to be revisited. But anyway, one of the great debates in politics in Rawls's day was between capitalism and socialism, and he's saying that his theory of justice can't determine that debate, can't say which side of that debate is right. And lots of people, when they read this, went, "Oh God, what's the point then? I've been reading. Here I am on the 350th page of this book, or whatever page it is, and you can't even settle this debate that we're having in society between capitalism and socialism. Is bloody hopeless." Right? That's the argument. Okay, now I do think that this argument is unfair to Rawls. His reply would be to say, my theory is a theory about the basic structure of society. It's not about the details. It's about the basic structure. It's about fundamental principle, not about policy prescriptions. I'm telling you what the basic principles of justice need to be in a society if it is to be just. I'm not telling you how to run the economy, or there's still less things like, how to organise schools for kids and how to organise universities and whether there should be public transport and what kind of provision for health there should be. I mean, I'm not talking about any of those things. They're important, of course, but they're just not my subject. Right? They'll have to be left to others. So an example of this would be to do with global warming. So let's just say that it's true that human-made global warming is happening, and as a result there's going to be very significant detrimental effects in the future. Now, a political philosopher can tell you that allowing this to happen without trying to stop it, without doing more to prevent it, is an example of intergenerational injustice. But exactly what should be done about it? Well, that's not the job of the political philosopher to tell you. Exactly what should be done, that's going to have to, scientists and others, economists and others are going to have to tell you that. Also, what kind of economic system will actually benefit people at the bottom? That's a matter for economics. It's not a matter for political philosophy. What political philosophy can do is tell you what kinds of questions the economists need to be asking in this area, if the economists are interested in justice. But the political philosopher can't also be an economist. It's also very important in this context not to be captured by certain kind of stereotypical ways of thinking about the state and the market and how they interact and the consequences that they have on, for example, inequality. So, I think there's this very standard view out there that says basically the free market produces inequality and state intervention helps redress this by achieving more equality. And so the idea is it looks as if Rawls's principles argue for more state intervention in the economy. And that might be right, but it's important to recognise that it could just as easily, as far as we know as political philosophers, it could just as easily be false. And I think there's good reason to believe that it may well be false. it seems to me, not the only one who says this, but it does seem to me that a lot of inequality in the modern world is a direct product, or direct or indirect product, of government behaviour rather than the market. And there are various ways of capturing this idea, but one way is that one slogan that I think is very telling in this context is the slogan that you sometimes read in newspapers and so on: capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. It turns out that in modern economies, the rich receive a very significant amount of state support, and one might think about, and it's never, of course, given to them in that way. I mean, no government would say, right, we're just going to provide social welfare for the wealthy. I mean, they don't do that, but they do things that have this consequence. Now, they do it for their own, they believe, very good reasons. And the classic example of this would be the bailout of the banks in 2008. And as the result, of course, of which was that the CEOs and so on of those banks paid themselves enormous bonuses as a result of being able to obtain these bailouts. And that would just be one example. The banks didn't need to be bailed out. There were other things that could have happened in order to protect the economy, but the requirement was to bail out the banks, or that the decision was to bail out the banks, and as a result, there's no question about this, over that period, the greatest recipient of, we don't call it social welfare, but it was state spending, was people who were already wealthy. Now, maybe it needed to be done. I don't personally believe that, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it needed to be done, but nevertheless, the result is that a fair amount of state money, taxpayer money, goes into the hands of the already wealthy. And I think that's actually characteristic of the modern welfare state. I'm not saying it doesn't do any good. That's not my view. One day maybe I'll teach a course on this. But I am saying that the fact is that the way that the modern welfare state is, it means that a lot of its resources go to the people who don't really need them, who are already quite well off. Another related example that I think it's useful to tell in this context is this, although it doesn't actually have to do with wealth, it's got to do with the creation of pollution. So most of us think that regulation around pollution in this country and in others is designed to and does prevent a lot of polluting from occurring, and no doubt it does. But just imagine this scenario. In this scenario, for those of you who are outside New Zealand and watching this and don't know, this is a big deal in New Zealand, because despite the image that our various governments have tried to promote of New Zealand being clean and green and so on, the fact is that our waterways are very heavily polluted. Now, just imagine you're in a situation like this where you have a house on a lake, and over the years you used to fish in the lake and catch fish, but the water that's flowing into the lake from the rivers is polluted, and as a result fish are dying, and that's interfering with your use and enjoyment of your property. Some of you already see where this is going. Your use and enjoyment of your property, because there aren't as many fish around, or there aren't as nice to eat, or they're worried about the toxins or whatever. Okay, what could you have done under the law that existed before there was any regulation around pollution? What could you have done? Well, you could have sued the polluters in a tort called private nuisance. Okay, and what did you need to show? You would have succeeded. Now, this is not entirely true in the United States, but it is true in the Commonwealth. You would have succeeded against the polluters if you could show that they were polluting, and if you could show that their polluting was in some way contributing to the to your problem, the fact that there aren't as many fish, or that they're being affected by toxins, or whatever it was. So all you needed to do was to establish that they were having they were making some contribution to the pollution in the river. And what would happen if you established this? You would be able to stop them releasing that pollution into the river, right? You would be able to get to use the legal jargon, an injunction to prevent them polluting the river. And you would be able to do that to everybody who was polluting the river. Everybody who was polluting the river. All that you had to show was that they were making a contribution to your problem. In this case, you would do that if you could show that they were polluting. And the key thing I want to say is you could stop them. You could sue them. All of these, you could bring an action against all of the polluters, and they would have to stop. You would get an injunction to prevent them from polluting. Now, what I want you to notice is that's not what happens in New Zealand. You can't do that anymore. And so one has to conclude from this that the consequence, not the intention perhaps, right, but the consequence of the regulation that exists in New Zealand around pollution allows people to pollute in a way that they wouldn't be allowed to pollute in the absence of that regulation. The anti-pollution regulation actually allows people to pollute, because if that regulation didn't exist, then we'd go back to the common law, and the common law would actually, the law of public nuisance, private nuisance, that law would actually allow you to stop the polluting from happening. Now, it's important not to make too much of that one example. It may well be that in general, overall, the pollution regulations prevent more pollution than would otherwise have been prevented by the common law. It may well be that there are problems with my example, that the real world application of my example. I'm sure all of this is true. But nevertheless, personally, I do believe that one of the consequences of our pollution, the various pollution regulations in New Zealand, is that people are allowed to pollute the environment more than they would have been able to pollute their environment if those regulations did not exist. In other words, the regulations have precisely the opposite effect from the effect that they present themselves as having. They present themselves as regulations designed to prevent pollution, but they are actually regulations that permit pollution, that allow more pollution than would exist if those regulations didn't exist. And my own view is that this is actually very common. It's very common that governments do things that present, or either the government intends them to have a certain effect, or at least pretends that it intends them to have a certain effect, and these regulations have the opposite effect or some contrary effect. I think that's very common, right? And so one mustn't simply assume. I think the more one thinks this way, the more one digs into this and realize, as I say, well, one day maybe I'd like to teach a course on this. The more one digs into this and the more one investigates it, the more one has to be suspicious of the kind of stereotypical, normal ways of thinking about governments and markets and so on in society. So as I said, there's this general assumption that government intervention means equality and leaving things to the market means inequality. And so because Rawls advances the difference principle, he's definitely arguing for government intervention in the economy. And what I'm saying is it's too quick to make that assumption. Rawls isn't saying anything of the sort. What the difference principle requires a lot of thought. And it's not the job of the political philosopher alone to provide that. That has to be provided in conjunction with economics and so on. It may well be that, in fact, Rawls's difference principle will require not an increase in the size of government, but a decrease in the size of government, and perhaps more targeting of social welfare towards people that actually need it, rather than towards the middle class. I mean, just for an example, in New Zealand, most of the money that's tied up in that's involved in working for families goes to people who are reasonably well off. Right? Not much of that money goes to the poor. In particular, it doesn't go to the unemployed because it only goes to people who are in work. So there's a very large a large level of government spending involved in the Working for Families packages, but it doesn't go to the least advantaged. None of it does. Okay, that's all by way of discussing one of the criticisms of Rawls's theory, that it's too indeterminate. It doesn't tell us what kind of economy we should have, exactly what the details of society aren't provided, and so on. And I think, for my part, I don't think that's a fair criticism. Another criticism, a different criticism, is that Rawls's theory is very radical, that has radical consequences that we may not be prepared to accept. So this relates especially to the natural lottery argument. As Ian Shapiro puts the problem, and I think this is putting it really very well, he says, it is an unusual argument in that it is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to dispute, yet it has implications that are so radical that not only does Rawls evade them, but few of the rest of us would be willing to live with them either. Now, what exactly is the problem here? The problem here is that if we take the natural, that is the idea that our natural talents are the result of the natural lottery, and so therefore are morally arbitrary. If we take that argument seriously, we're going to end up having to do things that strike us as, well, we'll be reluctant to accept them. For example, some people have very expensive preferences. Ronald Dworkin, a philosopher who's very sympathetic to Rawls, but talked about, but he thought that this was a powerful argument against Rawls, and he talked about people who have a passion for, what was it, plover's eggs and pre-phylloxera claret. Actually, I guess most pre-phylloxera claret isn't so great anymore. It's getting a bit old now. But in a very expensive wine. Okay, so it might be that, I'm happy drinking, let's say, $30 bottle of wine, whereas you want, to get the same pleasure, you need to drink a $3,000 bottle of wine. All right, well, why? And let's just say that those things matter to us equally, right? Why should that be taken into account? Now, I don't actually think this is all this compelling against Rawls, to be honest. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that. There's a more powerful way. It goes the other way. So not people who have really expensive preferences, but actually people who are quite different. I think this is more of a challenge to Rawls. So what about, for example, people who are happy to be at the level of the least off, but just don't want to do any work. So that, they take the sort of standard case that people, they just want to go. There's a guy who just wants to go surfing. No, that's all he wants to do with his life. He just goes surfing all the time. Every day that there's surf, he goes surfing. Okay, and then he demands social welfare. All right, he demands to be lifted to the highest level he could be. That is, he demands the application of the difference principle. Right, and the problem is that lots of people in this case will say, well, why should he get the benefit of the difference principle? Why should he be lifted to the position where he's, the highest position he could be, consistent with Rawls's principles? I mean, if he's not prepared to do his bit to contribute, why should we care about him? Right? I mean, imagine someone like that saying, hey, someone like that in the society in which we live saying, hey, if you tax people at the top more, then you can reduce the inequality between me and them, right? And yes, that would remove some of their disincentive to produce, but it actually turns out in the society that we're living, it wouldn't reduce their incentive by very much, and it would lift my position. Now, you might say that's perfectly fine for someone to run that kind of argument, someone who's unemployed but looking for a job and is serious about trying to make their contribution. But what about for someone who just wants to go surfing every day? Why should they be able to use that same argument? Now, there are some people who are influenced by Rawls's argument who just say, well, you have to let them make that argument. You have to let the surfer make that argument. You have to accept that they're entitled to social welfare even if they just want to bum around during their lives. That's just the way it is. But many people wouldn't be prepared to accept that. Now, there's another way of putting this same general objection, which goes back to the focus on resources. So let's talk about, say, the hunger and the distribution of food. So Rawls would say food is a resource, right? So Rawls would say that food has to be distributed fairly. Now, Amartya Sen, who's a philosopher, economist, number of things, says the real question's not the distribution of food. The real question is not how much food people have, but how nourished they are. Now, notice that this is to say that Rawls is focused in the wrong place, because we need to get at least closer to what's intrinsically valuable. Okay, so we looked at this before, and I said Rawls had his reasons for focusing on resources rather than on what he thought was intrinsically valuable. But Amartya Sen is saying, no, we have to focus at least closer to what's intrinsically valuable. What matters is not how much food people have, but how nourished they are. Because after all, says Sen, some people will need more food than others in order to be nourished. Right? And that needs to be taken into account. All right, okay, well, you might think, so what? Well, think now of health. Some people, in order to be at the same level of health as me, will require huge resources. Now, what's the issue really? Again, you might think, well, for Rawls, what we need is a fair distribution of health resources. For Sen, what we need is a fair distribution of health. Okay, and you can see the difference here. Okay, now, I have some replies to all of these, sort of on Rawls's behalf, as it were, to some of these objections. So I think one of the things to notice about all these objections is that they focus heavily on the difference principle and the consequences of the difference principle. And that's not surprising. It's not surprising that that principle attracts the most amount of attention, because that principle is the most controversial. We already all agree with the basic, most of the vast majority of us already agree with the basic liberties principle and the equality of opportunity principle. It's the difference principle that's radical, that's interesting, that's maybe exciting, that gets people's blood pumping, right? So that's where the focus tends to come. But it's very important in assessing Rawls's position that we don't forget that there are two other principles, and what's more, those principles have priority over the difference principle. Okay, and I think in particular, these arguments, when they're raised as objections to Rawls, generally ignore the presence of the basic liberties principle in Rawls's scheme. I think we need to remember that Rawls is concerned about freedom more than welfare. Freedom, liberty over welfare. Right? Liberty takes precedence. Of course, welfare is important, but liberty takes precedence over welfare. And so what matters here is not just that we live in a world where welfare is distributed fairly, but that we live in a world where people's freedom is maintained. And I think that's what Rawls is trying to achieve. Now, whether his principles succeed in that regard is another matter. So we can't ignore the role that freedom plays in Rawls's philosophy. Nevertheless, there is an issue here, and we shouldn't ignore it. The fact is that it looks as if laziness versus diligence is a natural talent, and that's just the way it is. And so if it turns out that some people are just naturally lazy, then they don't deserve discredit for that. That's Rawls's view. But it's very important to recognize. Let's just go back to that quote from Shapiro again. He says, "It's an unusual argument in that it is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to dispute, yet it has implications that are so radical that not only does Rawls evade them, but few of the rest of us would be willing to live with them either." Now, as I say, I think that's true, but the question is, what? What does this show? What does this prove? If the argument really is impossible to dispute, then maybe we just have to learn to live with the consequences. Yeah, maybe we're unwilling to live with the consequences, but if we just can't refute the argument, we can't even dispute the argument, we're just going to have to learn to live with the consequences. Yeah, maybe the surfer does deserve social welfare. After all, who says we have to live with an economy like this one? As Marx reminds us, we haven't always. It's not as if the economy is just a natural fact about the world. It hasn't always been like this, right? Why should we necessarily expect everyone to fit in with modern industrial capitalism, if that's indeed what we have. Maybe it's just right that it doesn't suit some people, and they nevertheless they need to be compensated for the fact that they live in a world that doesn't suit their natural talents. Well, I don't know how you feel about that, but the general point I'm making is that we can't reject Rawls's argument simply because we find it a bit uncomfortable. We can only reject it if we can come up with reasons why it should be rejected. And just like I don't like it isn't really a very good reason. Right? We have to come up with arguments against it. But the problem is, as Shapiro himself says, the argument seems impossible to dispute. Well, so we're kind of stuck with this. And I think if we can't find any good arguments against Rawls, if we can't find any good arguments against Rawls, we're just going to have to accept what he says. But that's the question. Can we come up with arguments against him? And that's really, in the end, a matter for you. Now, to finish, I want to discuss a criticism of Rawls raised by Jerry Cohen, a guy we met earlier on in the course, who's arguing from a Marxist perspective. And he wrote a whole book about this. I think a really great book, but it's called Rescuing Justice and Equality. But the essence of the argument can be captured in a nutshell in this slide, which is actually a quotation from somebody else, but it allows Cohen to make his point really well. So we're imagining a conversation between a well-off person and a worse-off person, someone who's doing very well and someone who's right at the bottom, one of Rawls's least advantaged people. And we're imagining that the well-off person is a Rawlsian, so he's committed to Rawls's principles, including the difference principle. And that's how Cohen presents the argument. It's to show that something is wrong with Rawls's theory, even given Rawls's own assumptions. Okay, so the well-off person says, look here, fellow citizen, I'll work hard and make both of you and me better off, provided I get a bigger share than you. And the worse-off person says, well, that's rather good, but I thought you were agreeing that justice requires equality, right, as Rawls agrees. Well-off, yes, but that's only as a benchmark, you see. To do still better, both of us, you understand, may require differential incentive payments to people like me. So think about the doctor, for example. Worse off, oh well, what makes them necessary? What makes them necessary is that I won't work as hard if I don't get more than you. Worse off, well, why not? Well off, I don't know, I guess that's just the way I'm built. Worse off, meaning you don't really care all that much about justice, eh? Well off, no, I guess not. Okay, I happen to think that this is an absolutely brilliant argument and an extremely powerful argument against Rawls, although exactly what it shows requires a bit of thought. But let's go back to the example of the doctor. Remember, when I was introducing Rawls's idea, I talked about a doctor. The doctors need to train for 10 years. So we need to pay them more than the average person in order to incentivize them to become doctors. And that's fine, because when they become doctors, they help everyone in society, including the people at the least advantaged position, including the worst off. Okay, now that argument relied on the idea that people wouldn't become doctors unless they were incentivized to do so, unless they were provided with more resources in society to do so. Now, when you make that argument and you make it in the third person, you just talk about doctors as this group, then the argument seems perfectly fine. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it. But when you put it in the first person, as the argument in that slide does, it looks hideous, right? So instead of saying, well, doctors need to be provided with extra money, extra resources, extra income in order to incentivize them to take the training, when you take that argument and you apply it to an individual saying, well, I'm actually not going to do what's good for society unless I get paid more. Right? It looks totally different now. That argument looks completely different now. Now, what Cohen is saying, and this is really, I think, a very powerful point, is that it's true, Cohen thinks, that in the society in which we live, we are going to have to incentivize people to become doctors. We are going to have to pay them more. And we are going, in general, we are going to have to allow inequalities to exist in order to benefit people at the bottom. That's true. We are going to have to do that. But what Cohen says is that's got nothing to do with justice. Okay, yes, we have to do it. He even says it's sensible to do it. It makes sense to allow these inequalities to exist to help the people at the bottom. But that's got nothing to do with justice, Cohen says. That's just because people are selfish. Yeah, people are selfish. People are selfish, and so they're going to need incentives in order to benefit other people. But that just shows that they're selfish. That doesn't say anything about what justice is like. So it's sensible to allow for inequality to exist to benefit the people at the bottom. It's sensible to do that, right? But the reason that it's sensible to do that is because people aren't very just. Right? In a truly, fully just society, people would do things because they were good things to do. People would become doctors, for example, because it helped people. In a fully just society, that's what people would do. So, says Cohen, the difference principle is a principle that's sensible. It's a good idea in this society to implement it. It makes sense. It's just not a principle of justice. It's a principle for applying in societies where people are selfish. What's more, Cohen says, and this reflects the influence of Marx, the reason that people are the way they are in this society is because of the way that the society is. If society became more just, people themselves would become more just. And so it's possible that if we had a juster society, people would think in a more just way. And so it may be that if we change society to be more just, we would change people to be more just as well. And maybe in a society like that, people would actually do things, not because it, or at least not only because it suited their self-interest, but people would do things because it was just. So people might, in a better society, say things like, well, I'm going to become a doctor. Yeah, I'm not going to get paid huge amounts more, but I'm going to become a doctor because that's a good thing to do. But maybe in a better society, people would think that way more. Now, I think Cohen is making whatever you think about that particular argument, Cohen is making a very powerful point here that Rawls ignores. And that is that justice could well be about creating a society in which people are more concerned with justice. That is, justice could be about creating a different society in which people are different. Rawls's argument, and we've seen this again and again and again, this general problem. Rawls's argument takes the society and the people within it as he finds them. And he's actually quite explicit about this. This is part of the wide reflective equilibrium approach. You just take the people as they are, as selfish as they are in the world in which they live in. You take basically the society in which it is, and you ask, given the way things are, how can we treat people fairly? Well, Cohen is saying maybe fairness requires us to change the way things are, to change the way that people are. Maybe justice is aspirational in that way as well. Maybe justice is aspirational in that it would like a different kind of person to exist. Right? And that seems to me to be a very powerful argument, whether you agree with Cohen's own Marxist take on that or not. The fact is that justice may require such radical changes to the world that people would be different and so would be incentivized in different ways to do different things. So one way of thinking about that is this. So Mill and Pareto, a criticism of them was they just took society as they found it, right, and then built a theory of justice on top of that. And the argument against that was, well, there may be structural injustices in the society as you find it. Rawls takes people as he finds them and builds a theory on that. And Cohen's criticism of that is there may be structural injustices in the people as they currently are. Now, as I say, I'm not saying that's necessarily right, but that strikes me as a very powerful argument and worth taking seriously. Maybe justice requires people to care more about justice than they currently do. With that in mind, we'll end this section on Rawls, and when we come back, we'll look at our last thinker, Robert Nozick.